Welcome along. Today we are going to be continuing our survey of alleged discrepancies and contradictions in the gospel accounts. So to summarize the categories of evidence that bear on the reliability of the gospels and Acts, these are the categories of evidence we've been surveying: undesigned coincidences, extra-biblical confirmations, difficult local knowledge, expressive silence, unexplained allusions, the principle of restraint, the criterion of embarrassment, artless similarities, and last week and this week we are covering reconcilable variations in the Gospels. Now, just in case any of you didn't tune in last time, we are just to define what a reconcilable variation is. So a reconcilable variation refers to when there exist two accounts of the same event, or at least two accounts that appear to cross over the same territory at some point. And at first blush, they seem so divergent that it is almost awkward, but then on further thought, they turn out to be reconcilable in some natural fashion after all. And so when two accounts appear at first so divergent that one is not sure they can be reconciled, that is significant evidence for their independence. And when they turn out, upon closer inspection or upon learning more information, to be reconcilable without forcing after all, one is almost certainly independent accounts that dovetail. So this term, reconcilable variation, was coined by Reverend T.R. Burks in his book Horror Evangelicae. And he writes, and I quote, "The entire sameness of the narrative in two or three distinct works would weaken and almost destroy the authority of all except the earliest, since it would be a strong proof that they were mere copies and that the writers had no independent means of information. On the other hand, positive contradictions would prove that one or other work was inaccurate, and the very numerous and important would go far to convict them of utter and willful falsehood. And hence the very test of historical truth in such cases is found in the substantial unity of the various narratives, their partial diversity, and the reconcilable nature of that diversity when due allowance is made for the purpose of each writer and the individual character of their separate works." And so Lydia McGrew writes concerning this argument. This is from The Mirror or the Mask. And I quote, "Put simply, what sort of documents are these that they manifest variation, showing independent information about the events and different emphases, and yet manage to cover the life of the same person while being reconcilable with each other again and again? If the authors were frequently inventing material but were not dependent, we would expect more intractable apparent contradictions than upon a fair and careful examination we find. If, on the other hand, they were dependent either upon each other or upon a common source, we would not find so many variations and even apparent contradictions requiring harmonization in the first place. This is not to deny that there remain some recalcitrant alleged contradictions, places where even the careful and just examiner may not be able to find a satisfactory plausible harmonization, but there are not a great many. For the most part, the variations are what we would expect to find among truthful, knowledgeable witnesses, giving different but complementary information. Thus, the fact that the Gospels are harmonizable so often and across such a wide variety of narratives means that they are consistent, when consistency on that scale would be hard to come by if the authors were not historical in intention and knowledgeable about the facts. So let's then move into some further examples of reconcilable variations besides those that we talked about last time. So let's start with a conundrum in the Gospel of Luke. In chapter 9 and verse 51, we read, "When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem." Now, this presents us with a problem because, according to Luke, Jesus doesn't go immediately to Jerusalem and die, rise, and ascend at that point. Rather, he goes wandering all around the lower parts of the lower part of Palestine, and even almost back up into Galilee. And in fact, Luke 10 verse 1 explicitly indicates that it was after these things that Jesus sent out the 70. And so what then are we to make of this? How does that make sense? Well, if you turn over to Matthew and Luke, we discover from Matthew 16, verse 21, and Luke 9, verse 30 and 31, that Jesus actually had emphasized in Galilee his impending violent death. So in Matthew 16, verse 21, it says, "From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised." In Luke 9, verse 30 and 31, it says, this is speaking about the Mount of Transfiguration, "Behold, two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem." So you'll notice the emphasis upon travel to Jerusalem in Jesus' statements and its connection with Jesus' death. And so it's not at all implausible, I think, that one or more of Jesus' followers would speak of his leaving Galilee for the last time and going to Jerusalem as being the time when the days are being fulfilled for him to be received up. Even if that individual knew quite well that Jesus was not actually crucified for another 6 months, and that at that particular time he was traveling to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, and not for the final Passover prior to his death. And so if one of Luke's sources used an expression like that, then it's quite plausible that Luke would have recorded it in his own gospel. And much of the rest of the material between chapters 9 and 19 is achronological narration. It's not necessarily recorded in chronological sequence. So Luke appears to have chunked in various teachings and incidents into that narrative, which presumably reflects Luke's own uncertainty or lack of knowledge concerning how many times Jesus actually visited Jerusalem during that period. When we get to John chapter 7, John's Gospel, chapter 7, verses 3 through 9, we read about Jesus' brothers taunting him about going to Jerusalem. It says that his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. For not," and it says, and the narrator adds, "for not even his brothers believed in him." Jesus said to them, "My time is not yet come, and your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify about it that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I am not going up to the feast, for my time is not yet fully come." After saying this, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. So Jesus' brothers apparently taunt Jesus, and they suggest that he go and perform miracles at the Feast of Tabernacles. And this might have been the feast in the autumn just prior to Jesus' death. And so when Jesus responds, Jesus connects his journeying or not journeying to Jerusalem with the question of whether his time had come. Now, presumably the one or more of the disciples heard this exchange because it's recorded in John's Gospel. And so they would likely have thought of his later decision to go up to the feast, after all, as an indication that perhaps his time had come, because bear in mind that that was an emphasis of Jesus' Galilean teachings in Galilee during this time. And of course, John also tells us about various occasions, likely during that period, when the religious leaders in Jerusalem attempted to seize and arrest Jesus, or when he was almost stoned for claiming divine status. The temple guards were sent to seize Jesus, but they backed off in John 7:44 and following, because apparently they were so impressed. He was almost stoned in John 8:59. He's almost stoned in the winter in John 10:31. In John 11, verse 7 and following, he's in the Transjordan area in the south, and he proposes to go back into Judea, to Bethany near Jerusalem, because his friend Lazarus has died. But the disciples, of course, try to dissuade him, because last time he was there, the Jews almost stoned him. And so that was probably sometime between December and the next Passover in the spring. And so the entire period then, after Jesus leaving Galilee for the last time, it appears to be this time of tremendous tension, when Jesus himself is predicting his impending execution, and the disciples never really know at what moment Jesus is actually going to be arrested and put to death. It's common knowledge at this time that there's this danger for Jesus in the Judea and Jerusalem area. And Jesus himself, as we've seen, has explicitly connected his traveling to Jerusalem from Galilee with his approaching arrest and execution. So in John 7, verse 10, it says that after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. So Jesus left Galilee, apparently, in this verse, John 7, verse 10, and he's never again seen in Galilee before his death. And so if this verse corresponds to Mark 10, verse 1, so Mark 10, verse 1 says, and he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him again. And again, as was his custom, he taught them. And so this seems to be speaking of the same episode after he left the Galilee region. This also seems to correspond with Matthew 19, verses 1 and 2. When Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Also, Luke 9, 51 and 52. When Jesus finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. So these all seem to be speaking about one and the same event of Jesus leaving Galilee for the last time. And so this seems to be describing Jesus leaving Galilee for the south for the last time, even though 6 more months or so transpired before Jesus' ultimate death by crucifixion. Now, what's interesting is that in Luke 9, verses 51 to 53, we read about Jesus' rejection by the Samaritans. So when the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem, and he sent messengers ahead of him, who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But the people did not receive him, because his face was set toward Jerusalem. Now, why might the Samaritans have not received Jesus and rejected Jesus and sent him away? Well, there's a little bit of background here. So Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, volume 20, tells us about tensions between the Samaritans and the Jews, because the Samaritans and the Jews disagreed over the proper place of worship. The Jews insisted that you had to go to Jerusalem to worship, and you had to go to Jerusalem to partake of the feasts and so forth. The Samaritans, on the other hand, believed that you ought to worship on Mount Gerizim. And so there was this tension between the Jews and the Samaritans. And of course, the Galilean Jews rather, had to travel from Galilee through Samaria to Jerusalem in order to go to the feasts. And of course, that escalated tensions between the Samaritans and the Galilean Jews. And Josephus tells us about this particular episode where tensions were particularly high. He says there arose a quarrel between the Samaritans and the Jews on the occasion following. It was the custom of the Galileans, when they came to the holy city at the festivals, to take their journeys through the country of the Samaritans. And at this time there lay in the road they took a village that was called Genea, which was situated in the limits of Samaria and the great plain, where certain persons thereto belonging fought with the Galileans and killed a great many of them. But when the principal of the Galileans were informed of what had been done, they came to Commanus and desired him to avenge the murder of those who were killed. But he was induced by the Samaritans with money to do nothing in the matter, upon which the Galileans were much displeased, and persuaded the multitude of the Jews to betake themselves to arms and to regain their liberty, saying, the slavery was in itself a bitter thing, but that when it was joined with direct injuries, it was perfectly intolerable. So apparently on this particular occasion, there were some Galilean Jews headed for Jerusalem through Samaria, and they actually got murdered by the Samaritans. So high were the tensions, and the Galileans were not happy with the way that had been handled. In John 4, also there's further background. So the woman said to Jesus, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." So this gives some backstory as to why there were tensions, why there were tensions when the Galilean Jews would pass through Samaria in order to go to Jerusalem for those feasts, because it particularly stressed the differences theologically between the Samaritans and the Jews. Now, John 7:10 sheds light, I think, on why Jesus was rejected by the Samaritans. So it says that after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. And so if Jesus left for the feast later than other pilgrims, the Samaritans would already have had many travelers from Galilee pass through Samaria on their way to Jerusalem. And presumably they weren't willing to take any more. They'd already had enough of these Galilean Jews heading through Samaria on their way to Jerusalem for the feasts. And so, in this case, the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And so they weren't willing to receive Jesus because he was coming later than those crowds had already passed through Samaria. Here's a related one. So this is actually, you could classify this perhaps as an undesigned coincidence or even as an external confirmation of the Gospels. Luke 13, verses 31 through 33, we read, "At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to him, 'Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you.' And he said to them, 'Go and tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I finish my course. Nevertheless, I must go on my way today and tomorrow and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish away from Jerusalem.'" So you see, of course, Jesus' sarcastic tone there in verse 33, which is so characteristic of Jesus' wit. Now, this doesn't appear to take place in Galilee. Jesus has apparently already left Galilee at this point and is, in fact, nearing the end of his life. We know this because in verse 22 of that same chapter, Luke 13, we read that he went on his way through towns and villages, teaching and journeying toward Jerusalem. So he's on his way to Jerusalem. He's already left Galilee. Now, this is significant because when Luke tells us about Herod Antipas, he repeatedly emphasizes that Herod Antipas was the tetrarch of Galilee. For example, in Luke 3, verse 1, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee. So, and if Luke also mentions this in Luke 23, verses 5 through 12. So, if Jesus is no longer in Galilee in Luke 13:31, what is the meaning of the Pharisees' caution that Herod Antipas is seeking to kill him? Isn't Jesus outside of Herod's jurisdiction already? Well, what's interesting, if you read Flavius Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, we read, "But as for the other half, he divided it into two parts and gave it to two other of Herod's sons, to Philip and to Antipas." So this is just after Herod the Great has passed away and his territory gets divided among his sons. So two other of Herod's sons, to Philip and to Antipas. The Antipas who disputed with Archelaus for the whole kingdom. Now, to him, that is Antipas, it was that Perea and Galilee paid their tribute, which amounted annually to 200 talents. So Galilee was not the limit of Herod Antipas's jurisdiction. In fact, Herod Antipas also was tetrarch not just of Galilee, but of Perea also. Now, what's interesting is that if you go over to the other three Gospels, we discover that all three of them confirm that Jesus was in Perea not long before his death. So he spent time shortly before his crucifixion in Perea, which is east of the Jordan River. Although, strikingly, the three other Gospels don't explicitly use that name, right? So Perea was on the eastern side of the Jordan River Valley. From about 1/3 the way down the Jordan River segment, connecting the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, to about 1/3 the way down the northeastern shore of the Dead Sea. Now, if you look at Matthew 19, verse 1, it says, "When Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan." Mark 10, verse 1 says he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him again and again, as was his custom, he taught them. John 10, verse 40, he went away again across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing at first, and there he remained. John 10:54, Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. But Luke doesn't inform us of where geographically the warning of the Pharisees took place. And so Luke dovetails with the other Gospels in a very casual and artless way that actually supports and corroborates and confirms the historicity of the account there. Here's another example of a reconcilable variation. So in Mark 3, verse 18, it says it's listing the disciples of Jesus, Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus. But according to Luke 6:16, who doesn't mention Thaddeus, it says, and Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So which is it? Was this disciple named Thaddeus, or was he Judas, the son of James? Well, the answer is that it appears that there are actually these are actually two names for the same person, just as Cephas, Simon, and Peter are all names for the one and the same person. There's other examples of this as well in the Gospels and Acts. So, for example, Matthew is also known as Levi, and Saul of Tarsus is also known as Paul. It's a common misconception that Saul of Tarsus changed his name at his conversion, but I don't think that's actually true. It seems more likely that Paul was simply an alternative name for Saul of Tarsus. And that was very, very common back then, to have multiple names for the same individual. And of course, John 14, verse 22 mentions this other Judas. It says, Judas, not Iscariot, said to Jesus, Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world? Now, Lydia McGrew, in her book, The Eye of the Beholder, speaks concerning this. She says, there was no reason for John to attribute this saying to so obscure a disciple, much less a disciple who unfortunately shared a name with a traitor and hence required a disambiguator to pick him out. It would have been easier to attribute the saying to a different disciple. There seems no reason other than reportage for John to make this note. So that's also an interesting point. Another example of a alleged discrepancy that we find in the Gospels, and this one also relates to the book of Acts, is the manner in which Judas Iscariot died. So in Matthew 27, verse 3 through in Matthew 27, we read that verses 3 through 10, we read that Judas throws the 30 pieces of silver into the temple and goes and hangs himself, and the chief priests buy a field with the money. Whereas in Acts 1, verse 18, Judas acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, and falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out. Well, which is it? Well, there's two difficulties actually in these passages. Firstly, how did Judas die? By hanging or falling? And secondly, who purchased the field? Was it Judas himself, or was it the chief priests? Well, there's a clue. So when a living person falls, right, he does not generally burst open. But this is what we might expect if, firstly, Judas was already dead, and it was his dead body that fell. Perhaps the body had already been dead and had been decaying for some time. And the body fell from some height. And in fact, the cliffs overlooking the Valley of Hinnom could well be the place where Judas hanged himself and his dead body fell and burst open. But that still leaves unanswered the question of who purchased the field. Now, plausibly, Luke or Peter, if Peter was Luke's source, meant to say with a kind of irony that since the money for Judas's treachery purchased the field, one might say that he purchased the field. And remember, of course, that for all we can tell, Acts 1 verse 18 might in fact be spoken by Peter himself. So it's possible that Luke or Peter actually meant to say that with some sort of irony, that since the money for Judas's treachery purchased the field, one might say that he himself purchased the field. So as if to say, what did he get for the price of his treachery? Nothing but the field where he died. I mean, in fact, it would seem to me slightly more likely that those are in fact the words of Peter, and in that case, of course, his audience knew quite well that Judas died before he had a chance to actually purchase the field, and it was in fact the priests who bought the field with the money, as recorded in Matthew. So what did he get for the price of his treachery? Nothing but the field where he died. So and verse the second half of verse 18 indicates that the situation became known to the residents of Jerusalem. Now, if verse 18 is written by Luke, it's possible also that there is, in fact, an actual minor error at this point. Or it may be that Luke is recording something that was said with that kind of figure of speech, but since Luke doesn't know the background, he misunderstands it as a literal occurrence, where there was more of a gap between the betrayal and Judas's death. So there's a variety of possibilities here. Here's one pertaining to the resurrection. We reviewed some pertaining to the resurrection last time. Here's some more. So concerning the stone of Jesus' tomb. So if we read Matthew 28, the first 5 verses, we read, after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the woman, do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. If we go over to Mark 16, verses 3 and 4, we read the parallel. They were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. Luke 24, verse 2, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. So what's the apparent contradiction? Well, according to critics like Bart Ehrman, Matthew intends us to understand that the women were witnesses to the descent of the angel and the rolling away of the stone. But Mark and Luke clearly indicate that it had already been rolled away when the women arrived. So the key question then is, does Matthew intend us to understand that the women were witnesses to the descent of the angel and the rolling away of the stone? Well, let's read Matthew a bit more carefully. So the entire passage regarding the angel, verses 2 through 4, is introduced by the Greek particle gar, or for, and its purpose is to explain the earthquake and the state of affairs as the woman found it upon arrival. Matthew uses an aorist participle, which could be, and in some versions is, translated with the English past perfect for an angel of the Lord had descended. Both considerations remove the appearance of contradiction. Matthew is not claiming the women saw the descent of the angel and the unconscious guards. Now, we could press this objection slightly further and ask, well, how does Matthew know about the descent of the angel if not by the testimony of the women? And the answer to this question, of course, is we don't know for sure. But it may have been from something said later by one or more of the guards themselves. Matthew apparently had other sources of information about them. So in Matthew 28, verses 11 to 15, Matthew, for instance, tells us about the report of the guard. So Matthew has some sort of other information source concerning those guards. So, this is speculative, of course. We don't know for sure what Matthew's source of information was at that point. Another example pertaining to the resurrection accounts. So in Mark 16, verses 5 and 6, we read that entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. In Matthew 26, verse 5, it says, but the angel said to the women, well, was it a young man or was it an angel? Luke 24, verse 4 says, while they were perplexed about this, behold, 2 men stood by them in dazzling apparel. So is it one young man? Is it an angel? Or is it 2 men? And actually, in Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus Interrupted, he actually misrepresents this text because he says that nowhere does Luke tell us that the women saw angels. He said it never says that. It only says that they saw 2 men. But Bart Ehrman is, as he so often is, completely incorrect on this point, because in Luke 24, verse 23, it in fact identifies these men as angels. It says that the women reported that they had seen a vision of angels. And so verse 23 of Luke 24 gives us the woman's interpretation of what they saw. And it very clearly says there that they saw angels. Now in John 20, verses 11 through 13, it says, Mary Magdalene stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. Now, first of all, then, is it angels or young men that the women see? Well, we have to, I think, get out of our minds that this is what angels look like. Angels do not look like what you might see on a stained glass window. Angels, rather, in Scripture, appear as men. So, for example, in Genesis 18, verses 1 and 2, the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. And of course, they turn out to be angels. One of them actually turns out to be the Melech Adonai, or the angel of the Lord himself. In Hebrews 13, verse 2, it says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. In other words, angels appear as men. You might not even be able to distinguish a man from an angel. So part of the objection then has been answered. Mark and Luke give a description of what the women saw. Matthew and John give an interpretation, perhaps the women's own interpretation of what they saw. So there's no contradiction between the description, men, and the interpretation, angels. But that still leaves unanswered the question of how many angels there were. Matthew and Mark focus on the, and I think this is an example of what you might call literary spotlighting, where Matthew and Mark focus on the one who spoke and do not mention the other, but omission is not the same thing as denial. Neither of them says that there was one and only one angel. And the scene with Mary Magdalene in John 20 occurs later, after Peter and John have come, inspected the empty tomb, and gone away again. A related question that we could ask is, what were the women actually told? So in Matthew 28, verse 7, it says that the angels tell the women, then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you. In Mark 16, verse 7, it says, but go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. And when did he tell them that? So in Matthew 26, verse 32, it says, but after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. So Matthew and Mark record the reminder Jesus gave them and follow it up with an instruction to go to Galilee. Matthew and John both report post-resurrection appearances of Jesus in Galilee, Matthew 28 and John 21. Luke omits the reminder and the instruction. So here's the account in Luke 24, verses 5 through 8. As they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise. And they remembered his words and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. So to help synthesize this, here's a chart that shows what the synoptic gospels report and what they omit. So Mark reports the reminder of Jesus' words and the instruction to go to Galilee. Matthew reports the reminder of Jesus' words, the instruction to go to Galilee, and the subsequent appearance in Galilee. Luke tells about gives a partial reminder of Jesus' words, the appearances in Jerusalem, and the ascension. So how can we give an account of the omissions then? Well, Mark, as for Mark, the text of the gospel is either incomplete or intentionally concludes at 16:8. There are scholars on both sides of that particular debate. I lean towards the view that he intentionally concludes at 16:8, but both views have their arguments going for them, with no elaboration on the post-resurrection appearances to the disciples. As for Matthew, having recorded Jesus' promise to meet his followers in Galilee, Matthew includes both the instruction to meet him there and the appearance there. His gospel terminates rather abruptly, perhaps like Josephus, he was running out of space on his scroll. As for Luke, like Matthew, Luke likely filled one scroll with his gospel and compressed many events that occurred across an undefined period of time into one terse narrative leading up to the ascension. And we touched on this a little bit last time as well. And Luke could afford to do this since he had a volume 2 that was going to be published, which we now know as the Book of Acts, and which he gives a clearer sense of the timeline. And he tells us in Act 1, verse 3, that it was extended across a 40-day time period that Jesus appeared to his disciples, giving many convincing proofs that he had been raised from the dead. Now, let's press the objection further. Why does Luke leave out the appearances in Galilee and the instruction to go there? Well, to answer this, we can note that we just don't know for sure. Luke was not an eyewitness. He relied on sources. He would naturally give priority to material not found in Mark. Luke's gospel, similar to Matthew's, is about the length of one full scroll. So there may not have been space to do more. Now, did the women tell the disciples? Well, according to Mark 16, verse 8, they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. In Luke 24, verses 10 and 11, it says, now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other woman with them who told these things to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. So the apparent contradiction then is that according to Luke, the women went and told the disciples what they had seen and heard. Now, Bart Ehrman insinuates that according to Mark, they said nothing to anyone, and those words do appear in Mark. Now, how do we respond to this then? Well, Mark, as we just mentioned, breaks off at chapter 16, verse 8, and so we can only conjecture as to how it might have ended. Whether we've lost the ending of Mark or whether he intended for whatever reason to conclude at verse 8, we can only conjecture as to what would have been included had we a fuller account of the resurrection encounters in the Gospel of Mark, but unfortunately we don't, and so we can only speculate. The most plausible reading of the phrase "said nothing to anyone," I would argue, is that the women did not run screaming into Jerusalem and tell all to the first male that they met. Rather, they ran straight to the disciples without telling anyone else. And in fact, this is consistent with Mark's normal usage of this sort of construction. So in Mark 1:44, for example, after Jesus has healed a leper, it says, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them." So in other words, he says, say nothing to anyone on your way to going to show yourself to the priest. In Mark 5:37, it says he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John. So in other words, he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John. So again, very similar sort of construction to what you have in Mark 16, verse 8. Another example, Mark 9, verse 8, suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them, but Jesus only. Or Mark 10, verse 18, Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone." So it seems to me to be quite plausible that in Mark 16:8, when it says they said nothing to anyone for they were afraid, that means they said nothing to anyone on their way to going to tell the disciples. Now, did the disciples go to Galilee? Well, Matthew and John report that they did. Mark breaks off before that would be reported. Luke doesn't mention it, but he does not say that they didn't go to Galilee, and he does not claim to be giving a complete, exhaustive account of all that Jesus did after his resurrection. In Acts 1, verse 3, it says he presented himself alive to them after his suffering by many proofs, appearing to them during 40 days and speaking about the kingdom of God. So it seems quite clear that Luke is not giving us an exhaustive account of everything that Jesus did after his resurrection. But we might still wonder, well, where was the first meeting? Where was the first encounter with Jesus? Was it in Galilee or was it in Jerusalem? Well, Luke 24, verses 36 and following describes an appearance of Jesus in Jerusalem on the evening of the same day that Jesus rose. John 20, verses 19 through 29 describes two such meetings in Jerusalem, separated by 8 days. The first of these meetings is almost certainly the same one reported by Luke 24. And that's the one, according to John, where Thomas was absent. So plausibly, then, Jesus' instruction to remain in Jerusalem in Acts 1, verse 4 was said to the disciples after they had returned to the Jerusalem area from Galilee during the 40 days in which Jesus remained on the earth. And so then that allows us to give an account of why of Jesus saying to the disciples to remain in Jerusalem, because they'd already been to Galilee and now they've returned to Galilee. So then it presumably took place that this instruction to remain behind in Jerusalem was said to the disciples after they'd returned to the Jerusalem area from Galilee during the 40 days in which Jesus had remained on the earth, perhaps shortly or even immediately prior to the ascension. And by all accounts, the ascension occurred from the region of the Mount of Olives near Bethany. So evidently they went to Galilee and then they came back. Okay, so we can press the objection further, though. So in Matthew 28, 16 and 17, it says, the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Now, if the 11 had already met Jesus in Jerusalem, why would some still be doubtful? There's yet a further problem, though, because in Mark 16, verse 7, it says, "Go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Now, if Jesus was going to see his 11 disciples, including Peter, later that evening in Jerusalem, why would the angels tell the woman to take a message to the disciples about meeting him in Galilee? Presumably, Jesus could just tell them himself when he met them in Jerusalem later that day. Well, here's a possible answer, and that is that only the 12 were present in the Last Supper when Jesus said he would go before them into Galilee in Matthew 26, verse 32. And so it's possible then that the woman's reference to meeting Jesus in Galilee was intended to function like a password, if you will, since it was information that they couldn't have otherwise known. And so that ought to have been confirmatory evidence that they really had met with the risen Jesus, because they wouldn't have otherwise known that information that Jesus had said to the disciples that he would go ahead of them into Galilee and meet there. And furthermore, plausibly, it was a bigger group meeting in Galilee than just the 11. So we understand that Jesus had a broader group of disciples besides the 12. In Luke 10, verse 1, for example, it says, "After this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them on ahead of him 2 by 2 into every town place where he himself was about to go." Also in Luke 24, we read about disciples on the road to Emmaus who were not part of the inner circle, 11 disciples. And so there was certainly a bigger group of Jesus' followers besides his inner circle. 1 Corinthians 15:6 also indicates that Jesus, after the resurrection, appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. So I think it's quite plausible that in Matthew 27, when it describes the appearance in Galilee, which was apparently by prior appointment, that this was to a bigger group than merely the 11. And so Jesus met with his inner circle ahead of that time, but there was a larger group meeting that was scheduled to take place in Galilee. So that in Matthew 27, we read, "The 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them." So this is a meeting with prior appointment. "And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted." And so presumably those individuals that doubted are not part of the inner circle or the 11 disciples. So in summary then, numerous instances of reconcilable variations between the gospel accounts provide strong confirmatory evidence of independent reportage, and cumulatively, I think the evidence suggests that the gospel authors are close up to the facts and habitually reliable. And so this, again, is just the pinnacle of the iceberg. Here's a few resources I recommend on this subject. The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices, is an excellent resource on this subject. Also, The Eye of the Beholder, The Gospel of John's Historical Reportage, also by Lydia McGrew, and Reverend T.R. Burks, who coined the phrase reconcilable variations, is his book, Hora Evangelicae. There's also another book, which I just finished reading, which is not yet published, also by Lydia McGrew, called Testimonies to the Truth, and that will come out sometime next year. So I look forward to that coming out, because I think that's also an excellent resource that has a whole chapter dedicated to this subject. So I will finish there, and I'm happy to entertain any questions. Thanks so much for your attention.